Anger over the latest twist to Brexit. Britain's Prime Minister suspends Parliament as the deadline looms for the UK to leave the European Union. What's Boris Johnson's plan? And is a no-deal Brexit now inevitable? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Hashem Ahelbarra. It's being described as a political coup. British MPs are crying foul after the Prime Minister suspended Parliament just weeks before Brexit. It leaves little time to prevent the UK leaving the European Union without a deal. Protesters and even members of Boris Johnson's own Conservative Party decry the decision as undemocratic. Opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn accused Johnson of trying to force a no-deal Brexit. A legal challenge is underway and more than 1 million people have signed a petition to stop the suspension. But the government denies it's trying to limit debate on Brexit.
The Prime Minister is clear that he wants to use a new parliamentary session in order to ensure that the people's priorities are met. But it's also the case that parliamentarians will have plenty of time when we come back next week to debate Brexit. They'll have plenty of time before the European Council in October to debate Brexit. And they'll have plenty of time to vote on and to reflect their views on Brexit after that European Council, at which we hope to get a deal. Parliament has spent the last 3 years talking about Brexit.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson's decision comes at a critical time for the UK. The British Parliament will be out of action for 5 weeks. While it's normal for a new government to take time out for a short period, this will be the longest suspension since 1945. MPs will return on October the 14th. That's just 3 days before the European Union summit, where Johnson is hoping to secure a new Brexit deal. And a mere 2 weeks before the deadline for the UK's departure from the EU on October 31st. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from London, Bennett, the Brexit commissioning editor at the Telegraph newspaper. From Brussels, Pieter Cleppe, head of the Brussels office at Open Europe, a think tank. Also from London, Jonathan Liss, Deputy Director of British Influence. Welcome all to the programme. Asa, normally when a nation faces an issue that could reshape its future, like Brexit, that's when you normally need the Parliament on board. But it's not the case in the UK. Why is that?
Well, simply because the previous Prime Minister tried to put a deal to Parliament and it got thrown back, rejected 3 times. And so now with the clock ticking, the new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, faces a crucial choice. Either he has to try and get a deal that is good enough to win a majority, but it's meant to be a majority of his side and maybe enough of the opponents. The trouble is the opponents are not really coming through. They want to stop him and say they show no interest in backing a deal. So then the alternative is much more controversial, of going for a no-deal Brexit. And this is why then the Remainer opponents are determined to do all they can to stop him. And so this week, the move to effectively reboot Parliament by bringing this current session to an end and having MPs come back in the middle of October means that MPs now who want to stop Boris have a choice. They have to either basically come up with the killer blow in the next fortnight, or it may well be too late in mid-October, because no matter what they do then, he could just sit in Downing Street and sit down the clock as no-deal Brexit happens by default.
Peter, how is this seen at the EU? Is it a simple procedure or an extraordinary moment?
This is still early days, but there are initial reports indicating that the EU side is finally getting the message that Boris Johnson is serious about no deal, and that he's actually very transparent in his strategy. His strategy has been to prepare for no deal in order to increase the chances of a deal. So the latest moves by the government in the UK mean that strategies like an extension or or ending the requests to leave the EU are less and less likely. So for the EU side, the choice is really going to be between no deal, which is dreadful. None of the sides are well prepared for that, or to agree to renegotiate the compromise that Theresa May already concluded with the EU. So far, the EU and particularly Ireland have been saying the same thing since November, really, that they refuse to continue negotiating. But I suspect that many people are now starting to doubt how wise that is.
Jonathan, Boris Johnson's spin doctors were on the media saying basically this is a simple procedure, that people have had enough of this parliament session, which has been described as the longest since the English Civil War of 1642, and that it's about time to call for the prorogation. Is that something that could build trust among the people in the UK?
No, that's an excuse for what's happening. We are currently 9 weeks from a crash-out Brexit, which would deliver food and medicine shortages by the government's own admission. And the government is responding by trying to shut down Parliament for 5 weeks of that time. So Parliament is not able to put forward alternative proposals and, crucially, may not be able to stop no deal at all, which is in flagrant disregard of parliamentary sovereignty and also of the will of the British people, because 2/3 of Parliament is opposed to no deal and 2/3 of the British people are opposed to no deal as well. So there is absolutely no justification for any kind of prorogation of Parliament, which especially takes in a week longer than Parliament was due to be in recess for conference season anyway. The only conceivable explanation is that the government wants to seize power from the people's representatives and hand it to an unelected Prime Minister.
Asa, when you look at the time frame now with this suspension, I think it gives the opposition no more than 5 days to be able to get their act together and see what would be their next move, whether to a no vote confidence or call for early elections. Is this time frame going to be enough for the opposition to tackle the issue?
Well, let's remember that back in March, opponents of a no-deal Brexit managed to fast-track a bill to order the Prime Minister, Theresa May, to delay Brexit in basically a day. It was sailing through the legislative stages so smoothly that Theresa May was basically already putting the request in to delay and extend Article 50 before the bill had even become law. Granted, we have a different Prime Minister now who is determined, if necessary, to ignore any such request if MPs make it. And as you're saying, yes, the opponents of a no deal have several days less to play with then if they want to try and stop him. But look, let's keep this thing in proportion slightly, because with prorogation, I think some people have been conditioned by the chatter. You'll have heard that effectively some Brexiteers wanted to suspend and shut down Parliament throughout, just for the next few weeks non-stop, so that Parliament could not do anything at all up till October 31st. And so therefore the revelation now that the recess, the break in parliamentary sitting will be a week longer than planned, has meant people are behaving as if it had been announced that Parliament would be shut down non-stop until October 31st. I'm making that distinction because we must remember then in the days they do have, fewer they may be in number, they can still do things. But of course the key is numbers, parliamentary arithmetic. They have to have a majority in favour for it to work.
Peter, with the prorogation, is this going to be enough for Boris Johnson to negotiate an agreement with the EU?
Well, let's definitely hope so. Now, I think that even if you consider this to be quite desperate and quite risky, which is an opinion that is fair enough to hold, I think you have to understand why the UK political class is ultimately resorting to this. It is because the European Union has basically told the United Kingdom that they can leave with a deal in an orderly, friendly manner under one condition. And that condition is that they make a choice. And the choice is between either accepting customs checks within the UK's territory, or alternatively, to outsource their trade policy to Brussels until further notice. Now, I think friend and foe will admit that this is quite an ambitious demand to make from the UK, and therefore nobody is, of course, surprised that ultimately the UK Parliament has not agreed to that. Now, there is a way out, the so-called backstop, which is the commitment of the United Kingdom to remain under the EU's customs regime to prevent customs differences between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I think most British politicians agree that this is fair enough and that this is acceptable for a certain period, but not indefinitely, not in the sense that the EU side would be able to unilaterally decide how long the UK remains under that backstop. So I do think that the obvious compromise still is a time limit to that backstop. But for that we need Ireland to move. And so far in Ireland, people don't seem to realize that if they risk a no deal, this will cause potentially more economic damage to Ireland than to the United Kingdom, and that it may also not only undermine the peace process because the EU would be insisting on a hard border in Ireland, but it would also perhaps damage relations between Ireland and its partners in the European Union.
Let's go to Jonathan, who seems to be willing to offer a different argument.
Well, the first thing to say about Ireland is that they have not asked for Brexit. And Ireland has a very long history of being mistreated by Britain, in fact, over 800 years, culminating in the partition of Ireland and in the Troubles, which only ended 20 years ago. So the memories of a hard border are extremely raw in Ireland. And so naturally, they want to do everything they can to ensure that there is an open and invisible border between Northern Ireland and Ireland in perpetuity. So you can't simply have a time-limited backstop that says, if you haven't got your alternative arrangements in place by, say, 5 years, we don't know what's going to happen, we'll just have a hard border anyway. That's not how an insurance policy works. And the backstop is an insurance policy. So the problem with the British government is they are effectively privileging trade with Canada, Australia, New Zealand over peace in its own territory. And that is the outrage of Brexit, and that's the outrage of the British government's approach to it. The backstop has to be the most important thing because Irish peace and prosperity is the most important part, and it's much more important than anything that we can do in Brexit.
Asa, couldn't this suspension end up being a gamble that would backfire and create many problems in the future for Johnson? For example, Ruth Davidson, who is Tory Scottish leader, resigned, and everybody knows that had it not been for her, Jeremy Corbyn would have been elected Prime Minister of England.
Oh, absolutely, on both counts. In that Ruth Davidson was the saviour of the Tories in 2017. And so the only reason they have any sort of presence in government is thanks to her. But granted, well, yes, we must remember with the outgoing Scottish Conservative leader that she has cited that she'd like to spend more time with her family, her young, blooming family. And so all credit to her, especially when you look at the alternative she'd have if she stayed in place, which is to preside and sell the Boris Brexit Conservative case to Scotland, which is deeply anti-no-deal Brexit and voted by a slight majority for Remain. Anyway, so then she would be having to really sell a sticky and difficult case. And so instead, she can take a break. She can still be a member of the Scottish Parliament and then, come back into frontline politics in many, many months to come. And of course, so what is the implications of this? Well, certainly, we must remember actually that she said that she feels Boris Johnson is still trying to get a deal. And so this is true, given that one of the things that the Prime Minister has said is that getting a deal is his highest priority. And also in this whole prorogation stuff, for the Queen's speech he hopes to have afterwards in October, which will lay out his programme once Parliament resumes, in that will be a withdrawal agreement bill. So in other words, a bill to implement a withdrawal agreement. So clearly he hopes in the coming weeks to still have a withdrawal agreement of some sort to present. Granted, we'll only know what sort of material will be in it in the final few weeks when we get nearer to the middle of October, because the theory is that in the heat of the 11th hour, with the pressure really on. That's where EU leaders will squeak out some concessions for him that they feel are possible. Although granted, on the whole time-limited backstop chatter, I think one of the reasons that they then may not rush to do that is because of all the Brexiteers saying, we won't be satisfied by a time limit. We want more than that. So look, we'll see in the middle of October what sort of deal there is, and maybe, just putting it out there, in the fear that Boris could genuinely go for a no deal, Remainers, Labour MPs could join. He could get just enough of a majority to push a deal through. We'll see.
Peter, isn't this something that will put more strains on the EU because they see the potential for a constitutional crisis in the UK, and at the same time they don't want to really end up with a messy withdrawal? Do you think that this is something that would put more pressure on the EU to offer some concessions to Johnson in the coming days?
I'm not sure if it's going to happen in the coming days, but I always thought that the EU is going to at least think about moving from its rigid position when it became clear that Boris is here to stay for the period until 1st of November. And there are some initial reports in German media that people are starting to think. In Ireland, we haven't really heard all that much. Now, I think this is perfectly solvable. Of course, even Boris Johnson admits that the alternative arrangements cannot be ready by the end of October. He actually wrote in his letter to Donald Tusk that it may take longer than the end of the transition period. So he thinks it's going to take at least 3 years. The EU side, at least the Austrian diplomat dealing with Brexit, has mentioned that it could take 10 to 15 years. So that sort of is where both sides are. I do think they could find each other somewhere in between. The EU side could safeguard the United Kingdom, could reassure them that this backstop would be time limited by putting a time limit on it, but perhaps a bit longer than the UK would really hope for. And of course the UK could also make some concessions. For example, granting some checks in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, particularly on food. So basically submit Northern Ireland to the EU's food regulations would help a lot. Simply because a lot of the challenges come from particularly milk farmers in Northern Ireland that would fall under a different regulatory regime after Brexit. So there are
very complex
solutions conceivable, but we need goodwill.
Jonathan, if you see this issue from a different perspective, then you might think, or you might say, that the guy, Mr. Johnson, is smart. In fact, because he saw that Theresa May tried 3 times to negotiate a deal that was rejected by the Parliament. He's trying a different tactic, which is basically the prorogation. If worse comes to worse, he will call for new general elections. Polls suggest that he's likely to further consolidate his gains.
Well, I think we have to ask what the point of Brexit is. Is it to deliver parliamentary sovereignty, or is it to take that parliamentary sovereignty away? What prorogation represents right now is an all-out assault on our democratic institutions. If we don't have parliamentary democracy, we don't have any kind of democracy in this country. It is not the will of Parliament for Parliament to be disbanded without its consent. And so for Johnson to try a different tactic, which is to force through his will, to blackmail the EU, to blackmail MPs by asking the Queen, politicising the monarchy in one of the most controversial moments of the Queen's reign, to try and clear a path for his Brexit, then we have to ask what really was the point of any of this and what good it could ever do. That's the fundamental issue here, and MPs have every right to fight this tooth and nail.
Asa, to what extent this move was dictated by an opportunistic approach by Johnson to rally all the Leave camp behind him? I think he saw Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party gaining more momentum, and he said, this could be my opportunity to tell the people, you know what, I am standing on your behalf, and therefore any other upcoming election, the voices and the votes will go for him?
Well, look, politics generally is driven by opportunism on both sides, full stop. So, of course, certainly Boris Johnson will have seen this, that in making his request, he'll have made sure that it was very carefully worded. Because, for example, this is why the Prime Minister makes absolutely clear that it's nothing to do with Brexit, it's just because he wants to reboot government and all that, because that would be the reason then Her Majesty the Queen was able to approve the request, because it just seems constitutionally legitimate. It's just part of a normal proceedings for Parliament. Of course, it just so happens that it benefits the Prime Minister and puts the squeeze on his Remainer critics. Now, granted, in the election, as you're saying, you're absolutely right. You know, the polls do indicate that he would then squeeze through, and this is on the strength of Nigel Farage and his Brexit party then potentially lending support, having a sort of pact with his Conservatives, in which then Brexiteers would know that there is only one mainstream party that is willing to deliver and to push through Brexit, you know, deal or no deal, as the Brexiteers of Nigel Farage's team would prefer. And that would be Boris Johnson. Meanwhile, and this would be the risk for them if Boris fought a very, very Brexit election, is that then the Remainers would be split. Because Jeremy Corbyn in that scenario, then he would be eagerly taking up the mantle of Remain, because the alternative is no deal under the Tories. And meanwhile, Liberal Democrats, they say all sorts of things about Brexit in their opposition, and the Greens, so their vote would be split. So it could well play well for Boris. Equally, we've seen that best laid plans often go awry.
Peter, the EU still remains adamant it won't reopen withdrawal agreement. Now with this move by Johnson, what kind of impact do you think it will have on the status of the Irish border insurance?
At the end of the day, the Irish border will have to be figured out, whether in the context of a deal or in the context of no deal. Now the UK side has made clear that they won't be imposing border checks on the Irish border. So the real question is, what is the EU going to do? How hard is the EU going to play it? Are the EU side going to tell Ireland, hey, you have to guard our external border? Well, yes, Angela Merkel has already made that clear. So far, the Irish government has been unclear how it will deal with that. It has admitted that some checks will be necessary, but then the question is, if it's not properly checking the Irish border, will this then not create tensions with the other EU countries?
Jonathan, do you think that Jeremy Corbyn would be this time more inclined to call for a vote of no confidence?
Well, it's heading to that point, because as Asa was pointing out, we have very little time now for a legislative solution to this crisis, because Johnson has taken away so much of their possible time. So the government will do all it can to thwart MPs trying to stop a no deal which will deliver food and medicine shortages. So that means that politicians will then have to go to plan B, which is the vote of no confidence. And the thing is, that I was mentioning a bit earlier, is that Remainers will now unite, because they've seen that this government is prepared to play dirtier than we've ever known in modern British politics. They're prepared to rip up the established rule books. And so Remainers will have a much better chance of delivering their objectives.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Jonathan Liss, Pieter Cleppe, Asa Bennett, I really appreciate your contribution to the programme. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here in Doha. Bye for now.